A while ago I made a device to make a trade between Gen 2 and Gen 3, to finally bridge the gap between the generations. But after I finished I thought, why was this never possible back in the day? The main reason I often see is the big difference of the Pokemon structures between the two generations. But I don't think this was the biggest reason why they never did it. There are definitely ways to make them compatible with each other. Nintendo even made it possible themselves to send over Gen 1 and Gen 2 Pokemon to Pokemon Bank. They notably did some things different when converting the Pokemon compared to my solution. Like for example, when transferring from the Virtual Console, the IVs will be randomly generated, but 3 of them are guaranteed to be the max value of 31. And if the Pokemon happens to be Mew or Celebi, then 5 of its IVs will be the max value. Another thing they did differently was erasing the stat experience and setting the EVs to 0, instead of trying to convert this. They could have chosen a similar way to transfer over Pokemon to Gen 3 back in the day. So no, this was not the reason why it was never possible. They have already stated themselves why it was never possible to make this trade happen. It was never possible due to them not being able to solve the communication issues between these two generations. But what does this exactly mean? To fully understand that, I'll first need to tell you more about the link cable and what goes through it when you make a trade. Let's analyze the different versions of the link cable. In total there are 4 different generations of the link cable. First we have the link cable that was only used to connect 2 original Game Boy models. In the beginning the link cable was mostly used for competitive reasons like playing Tetris, but later on it was also used for communicating back and forth, like for example trading Pokemon. This cable was later replaced by a smaller design that was used in the future Game Boy models. And by using an adapter piece, this cable was able to be backwards compatible with the previous design. In the end this design lasted until the GBA was released. Because the GBA came with a completely new link cable that made it possible to communicate with up to 4 players. The design had the same size as the previous generation, but it came with a little knob on top of it. This was done so it would not fit in the previous Game Boy models. And lastly we have the version that was used for the Game Boy Micro. It is essentially the same as the previous generation, but again it was made smaller. I think you can see as well that from these 4 generations there are 2 big versions of the link cable. The first 2 generations and the last 2 generations are similar to each other. This is reflected when we take a look at what's inside the cable. So we will do that next. We will start with the first 2 generations of the link cable. Inside there are 4 wires that are connected to pins 2, 3, 5 and 6. In the schematic here you can see how these pins interconnect to each other. Pins 5 and 6 are connected, but pins 2 and 3 are swapped. This is done because these pins are used for transmitting and receiving. Now we have pins 5 and 6 left. We know that one of these pins has to be the ground. The ground is the reference for voltages, and for these Game Boys to communicate they have to share the same ground. The ground is usually placed at the last pin, so pin 6 is likely for this. Now we only have pin 5 left, and this is likely to be the clock signal. Now that we're done with that, let's take a look at the signals. We can analyze the data over the link cable using a logic analyzer. A logic analyzer is a device that can capture digital signals, like the one sent over the link cable. The first thing we can note is that the clock signal is indeed on pin 5, and the data is on pin 2 and 3. Specifically, pin 2 is for transmitting and pin 3 is for receiving. So how do we read this data? We can read the data by using the clock signal. The clock signal will tell the Game Boy whether it needs to read or write. Since the clock starts high, the first action will be when the clock falls low. This will tell the Game Boy to start writing their first bit. When the clock goes back up again, it'll tell the Game Boys to read the bit that the other Game Boy has written. This will repeat a total of 8 times until 8 bits has been transferred. Such a protocol is called SPI, or Serial Peripheral Interface. One thing to note about SPI is that the protocol has a master and a slave. So how is this decided with the Pokemon games? The master will be the one who first gets to this screen. A fun fact, you can see during the trade who the master and the slave is. The name on the left is the master and the name on the right is the slave. One last thing to note about this protocol is that the signals are sent at a 5-volt voltage. Next up is the cable for the GBA. As we know, things changed with this cable to make it possible to communicate with up to 4 players. To start our analysis, let's first again look at the pinout of the cable. Inside the cable are now 5 wires that are connected to pins 2 through 6. These 5 wires on each side connect to each other in the middle, where there is a connector for the next link cable. Let's see how they interconnect. In this little schematic I made, you can see that pins 4 through 6 are all connected to each other. Pin 3 on the purple connector is connected to the ground. and pin 2 on the purple connector is connected to pin 3 on the gray connector. This connection of pin 2 to pin 3 keeps going if you add more players. The first in this chain is always the master, the one who has pin 3 connected to the ground. This will always be the one with the purple connector. Now we understand the interconnection of these cables, but how does the communication work? Let's take a look at this data transaction. To indicate the start of a transmission, the master will set pin 5 low. Shortly after this, the master will send its data over pin 4. To indicate that the next player can send its data, pin 2 is pulled low. As you remember, this is only connected to the next player in the line. Next up, player 2 will send its data and it will again pull pin 2 low. But in this scenario, there is no player 3, so the data transmission will end. This is indicated by the master pulling pin 5 high again. So all the data is now sent over one data line instead of two, and the clock is completely removed. That is because the protocol we are using is 16 bits UART. This uses start and stop bits, so a clock is not necessary. But what you do need is the baud rate of the transmission. With the logic analyzer we can see that the baud rate is around 115,200. One last thing to note about this protocol is that the voltage used for transmitting and receiving is 3.3 volts. So by comparing the two protocols we can see that they communicate in two very different ways. Making a trade work using the GBA cable is just simply not possible. The wiring is just completely different. But if you could use the original cable, it might have been possible. There's one thing I haven't told you yet about the GBA protocol. The GBA uses SPI to communicate with a wireless add-on. It is slightly different, however, it uses 32 bits per transmission, and the clock frequency is a lot higher. But if you could somehow lower the clock frequency to match the old Game Boy and shorten the data transmission to 8 bits, it should be possible to make it work. Now you might be thinking, but what about the voltage differences? This is not that big of an issue. The pins on the 3.3 volt side are tolerant enough to receive 5 volt signals, and the pins on the 5 volt side detect 3.3 volts as a high signal. My device, for example, runs on 3.3 volts and is able to communicate with both protocols seamlessly. So that checks out. Maybe you simply don't have the option to change configurations of the data transmission from the cartridge, making it impossible to communicate with previous hardware. But this is only speculation. And with this we've reached the end of our analysis about the differences between the link cables. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.